I think the endocannabinoid system is the most important system because it regulates all of the other systems.
Hi, I'm Chad Westport. I've been involved with cannabis for over 30 years. I'm a graduate of SVC and WSU, where I studied sustainable agriculture and small farm systems. Commercially, I've worked at the largest indoor facility in our state, and I've consulted with our legislatures on the medicinal cannabis program. My background and training give me the experience to easily guide new growers through the home cannabis growing process. It's easier than you think and far more rewarding than unloved, mass-produced, chemically treated commercial cannabis. Enter the woo. Westport University. Today we have a special long format version of Westport University. Now, the other year I had the chance to sit down with Miyabe Shields. They are a trained professional when it comes to interactions with cannabinoids in the body, and that is something that is very important to me as a medical cannabis patient. I want other people to understand how it works, some of the potentials, and maybe some of the drawbacks. That's why we need to talk to professionals instead of just put out bro science. So that's what this episode is about. We're going to talk about the endocannabinoid system, CB1 and CB2 receptors. We're going to talk about some research. We're going to lay the foundation for you to understand how cannabis works in your body. So let's get into it. Hey everybody, Chad Westport here, and I am back with a special series about cannabis and our body. And I have brought on someone who I look up to and get a lot of great information from, Dr. Miyabe Shields. So thank you for joining us today. I appreciate that. Can you maybe tell people a little bit more about your background and experience?
Sure. So I'm a pharmaceutical scientist, and maybe I'll back up and say that I started smoking weed when I was 15, and it changed my life. Cannabis saved my life, and I've dedicated my life to studying cannabis and understanding the brain and how it can be used for therapeutic benefit and how to maybe maximize those benefits and minimize the risks. So I was in academic pharmaceutical research in the eicosanoid system, which is downstream of the endocannabinoid system, for a couple years. And then I did my PhD on the structural biochemistry of the endocannabinoid system. And then I spent 4 years in the industry, where I was the chief scientific officer for a startup. And I studied the rare molecules that are only present in high temperature. So in smoke, dabbing, or vaping. So rare cannabinoids that are produced at higher temperatures and combinations that don't occur in the flower as its own. And I'm really excited to be here too. I love teaching about this stuff. I think that everyone should understand themselves and their cannabis use because it makes cannabis just that much better.
And for the people out there, again, we want to give them the best, most reliable information that we can from the best sources that we can. And I'm glad that you're here to do that. So thank you.
All right, shoot a question.
All right. So the first kind of thing is you mentioned the endocannabinoid system. So we often refer to it as ECS. What is the ECS endocannabinoid system, and does everybody have one?
Yes, everybody has one. Every warm-blooded animal has one. Dogs, cats, mountain lions, regular lions, cheetahs. Well, yeah, okay. All the warm-blooded animals have them. Um, the endocannabinoid system is a system inside our brain and body. It's located a lot in our fat and small intestine, our immune system as well. Everyone has one. And a lot of people are familiar with the serotonin system or the dopamine system as a signaling system. So it is a system within the body that is used to talk. The body uses it to talk to itself. And the endocannabinoid system is just another type of system. It is actually a system that regulates the others. All of us have it. And actually, it is the largest system by weight. The CB1 receptor, which is the main receptor of this system, is the most prevalent. We have the most of that receptor in our entire bodies, which I think is kind of a fun fact. It's pretty much everywhere. It's all over. Although it's a lot in our brain and then a lot in our fat cells too.
Now, when was this endocannabinoid system discovered? Is this a recent discovery, or have we known about this for a long time?
Actually, it's more recent than some of the other ones, which is why serotonin, dopamine, GABA, it's why the others are better known because they were discovered first. The endocannabinoid system was discovered in like the 90s. So we knew that it was likely there because we isolated THC and CBD. Dr. Meshulam did in the 60s. So once that was isolated, it was like, okay, these molecules are active in cannabis. They must be interacting with something. And it wasn't until the 90s, though, that they were actually able to find the receptors. And actually, so since then, it's been growing and growing and growing. The system gets larger and larger as we find more things that interact with it. In terms of like its evolutionary history, the earliest evolutionary like animal that has an endocannabinoid system or has activity with the endocannabinoid system is a hydra, which is in the Cnidarian family, and it's part of the same family as jellyfish. So I
Okay.
mean, it is ancient, ancient. Like actually, the enzyme that I did my PhD on. So enzymes are little machines, and the enzyme that I did my PhD on is a little machine that chews up and deactivates the endocannabinoids. That's like the
Mhm.
job that it has in the body. That enzyme, it's called ABHD6. It's a very unsexy name for a thing, and when I was studying it, we were looking at the other things that are similar that we know. And actually, the most similar thing that I was able to find when I was making a model of it, the most similar thing that we have found besides, the one that is in us that we have, came all the way from archaebacteria. So it was
Mm.
way back from when we were like single celled organisms. So we have only known about the endocannabinoid system for like 30-ish years or so, but evolutionarily the endocannabinoid system is very, very old. It's just as old as the others, if not older.
Wow. And you mentioned animals, warm-blooded animals will have this. So is that where we're able to get a lot of the studies about endocannabinoid systems or receptors? Has there been much on a human model, or do we have that advantage because these warm-blooded animals have endocannabinoids and we can use them to relay or confirm effects?
Totally. I mean, so there's different levels of research, and if we're talking about just drug discovery as like, which is just, that's the area I was in. Like when you're trying to discover a new pharmaceutical drug, there's sort of like a pathway of types of testing that you do, and you'll start by testing it in a test tube. And so there's no animals involved whatsoever. And that is what I did for my PhD on. I actually took the like enzymes or the receptors, I took them and I created them
Oh,
in a
wow.
test tube and tested them on their own. So without any sort of animal. The next level up would be animals. And sometimes people are testing them like, yeah, it's very, very common to test endocannabinoid system, like new pharmaceutical tests and stuff on like rats, mice. Some of the early studies on cannabis done by Dr. Toby Yarbe, who's like, was such an influential scientist in my career. He was just the bomb. He was so cool. Um, Rest in peace, Toby. He is like just so influential. I mean, he did a lot of the early studies on it, and he used to do them on doves and pigeons. Um,
Okay.
like training them about like he would basically have them in one of the first PowerPoint presentations he ever gave. He showed the apparatus for how he would give the animals cannabis, and it basically was a bowl piece on top of a glass container where the animal was inside, and then he'd hook up a hose and light the bowl piece, fill the
Hot box
chamber
it.
with smoke, and close it. Which later they moved on to doing like either injections or orally administrating it by like syringe lavage. But we do use it actually to test on animals a ton, just to like answer the question point blank.
Well, that's great. And I think that's a good overview of just kind of the endocannabinoid system and a little bit of how it works. Everybody. We have covered the endocannabinoid system on the previous episode. And today, one thing that I want to talk about are the CB1 and the CB2 receptors, just kind of what they are, where they are, and maybe some of the binding potentials that these cannabinoids have. So,
This is an interesting one because they're not as similar as you would think that they are. But to backtrack about how they fit in with the endocannabinoid system is a signaling system, and it is made up of these receptors, like the CB1 and the CB2 receptors. They are the things that are like light switches that get turned on by the endocannabinoids. So endocannabinoids are molecules. They are, floating around molecules in our body, and they bind to the receptors. And then the last thing in the system is the enzymes, which I mentioned last time, are like little machines. And a lot of the enzymes, the job is to either create this or to deactivate it.
mm,
And so that's what the enzymes do. They're like the little machines that are either creating or deactivating the molecules. And so the CB1 and CB2 receptor, how they fit in, they are the two main receptors of the endocannabinoid system. Now, I mentioned it also last week, there's more and more things that we've been discovering that are part of the endocannabinoid system. It's still growing, but for the most part, actually, the CB1 receptor is the most well characterized. We've studied it the most. The CB2 receptor was discovered after it. They do not share a lot of homology, which means that even though they are related to each other because they both interact with the endocannabinoids, they're pretty different in shape. And it does look like they are located in different parts and in different systems of the body. So, like,
mm.
usually people will say that the CB2 receptor is more associated with the immune system, whereas the CB1 receptor is more associated with like the central nervous system and the brain types of effects. This is something that I think is debatable depending on what studies you're looking at
Okay.
and who is doing them. Because like there are immune system cells in the brain, right? Microglia is an entire class of brain cells that are immune system cells. And I once witnessed like two scientists who both studied the CB2 receptor kind of like not yelling at each other, but having like a heated discussion over whether or not they would say that the CB2 receptor was in the brain. This was in 2016, so I'm not sure if
Okay.
they've come to a consensus since then. But it's something that definitely struck me, and that we still are looking into both of these receptors. I mean, we didn't get a good structure of the CB1 receptor, I think, until the last year of my PhD. I think it was 2018. So, I mean, we are still really early in learning more about them, what they do, and in general, just about all receptors and what they do. But to just kind of give an overview of it, the receptors are these kind of like globular things, and they're these big sort of globby moving around things. And when the molecule, in this case an endocannabinoid, or let's say THC, right, a phytocannabinoid, the molecule comes and activates that receptor, like the CB1 receptor or the CB2 receptor. When you say activate, what you mean is that the molecule is sticking into, it goes inside, or sometimes it sticks to the top. And when it does that, it actually changes the shape. And then all of a sudden, the
Mhm.
receptor changes shape, and that's what activates it. It's this
Oh, wow.
three-dimensional change. And when that three-dimensional change happens, all of a sudden there's a bunch of it sets off a domino effect of things that end up occurring. And for the most part, both CB1 and CB2, the domino effect that it sets off will be to reduce like levels of excitability in the brain. That's in general, it's not always true, and it's not always true depending on what parts you're talking about and whether or not there are other things present. But there's this very, very long cascade of events, and that is what leads to you feeling something. So it starts with the molecule binding to the receptor, and then that big long domino chain of effect goes off, and all of it happens just in like nanoseconds, milliseconds, like
Wow.
barely any time, and then you feel high.
A blink of the eye. Now, how do we know that they were there, or how did we discover it? How do we see them? Is it like the bioluminescence where it's neon on the screen and you get to see them doing their thing, or how did we come across that?
Very, very cool question. So It depends, and it depends on it is possible to use bioluminescence now. So that's called like usually those are like fluorescent probes, and basically it wouldn't look like this, but basically I actually they have made some of them, but you take this molecule and pretend like you added this is THC, and pretend like you added a fluorescent like light to the end of here, right? And then
Rudolph.
yeah, exactly. And then this goes around in the brain and it binds everywhere in the brain, and then you see the light. So
Okay.
that does exist, but to my knowledge, like the most research that's been done with cannabis with the cannabinoid receptors has actually been done with radioactive ligands. So
Hmm.
that means that they make a molecule like this, and usually it's not THC; it's something that will bind even stronger. They make a molecule like this, and they make it out of something that's radioactive, not in a harmful way radioactive, because there's plenty of different types of radioactivity. And you will go and then it goes into the brain and then it binds there, and then when you take the scan it'll light up with like you have detectors specifically for that type of radioactivity, and that's how you can see where they are in the brain. If people are interested in looking it up, it's PET scanning, and people have like I think people get PET scans regularly for cancer and other things. It's positron emission tomography, I think is
Hmm.
what it stands for. um, and that's at the larger level of like how did we even know? But I mean, to answer your question, I don't think that we knew for sure they existed until the late 90s. And then in
Right.
terms of finding them and cloning them, sometimes now more recently, we know that they exist because of the DNA.
Hmm.
So I can't remember when the genome was completed, but it also was fairly recent. I think it was like in the early 2000s was when we finally completely mapped the entire DNA of the human
Wow.
genome. The things that are within us that make us who we are, the genes, our DNA. We have a lot more in common than we do have different, even if it doesn't always look or feel that way. We have a lot of things in common, and for the most part, all of us have a lot of the same genes, and we have different variations of those genes. And at this point now that we have it all sequenced, so it's like a giant database of the sequence of all the DNA, we are actually able to go back in there and we're able to find um, receptors that are in the DNA that we didn't know about.
Wow.
And there's a bunch of them that actually, many of the new endocannabinoid system receptors were discovered this way. They're called orphaned receptors. Kind of sad, but they're called orphan GPCRs. And which is a G protein coupled receptor. That's the type of receptor that both CB1 and CB2 are. Because there's other types of receptors as well, but I think it's something like 75% of drugs target GPCRs. So
Oh, wow.
they're the biggest, they're like one of the largest classes of drug targets. And
And sorry to interrupt you here, but when you say drugs, that includes pharmaceuticals. We're not talking like street drugs as well. I mean,
no, yeah,
all the same.
talking
Okay.
pharmaceuticals, but yeah, the mu opioid receptor is a GPCR, like serotonin receptors. Most of them are GPCRs. One of them is not for sure. The dopamine D2 receptor is a GPCR. And like there's exceptions, like the GABA receptor is not, right? So I mean, but most of the targets, like a big chunk of them at least, are
Okay.
G protein coupled receptors. And so there's these new ones that they found in the genome, and that's how we've been discovering them more recently. And then we end up finding out that they're endocannabinoid receptors. Like GPR55 is a pretty interesting one if people want to deep dive into like one of the more recent endocannabinoid ones. There's been a good amount of research on that one. GPR 118 also seems to have like some good links to the endocannabinoid system,
Hmm.
but they're they aren't the super obvious ones. They're kind of like
Right.
we're still learning a lot about the brain, and don't feel like the endocannabinoid system is the only one that is that unknown, because it is true in the other areas too. um in terms of like dopamine and serotonin, there is a whole class of receptors called the trace amine receptors. They're tar receptors. And so there's an entire class of trace amine receptors too that are these, we're in this period of extreme rapid growth in neuroscience and receptors and pharmacology, because we finally have like advanced technology to look at it. And so there's just been giant changes in what we are able to see and to
Mhm.
study, within, even since there's been new technologies since I was out, like I like that I look at it and I'm like, wow. It's like, I think that I was sort of like, you know, I've always been in awe by science and by technology. And the first time that you see, so in terms of how do we know the shape of it too, it's this technique called X-ray crystallography. And we can use X-rays and we shoot them at a crystal. And, in a camera, for people who understand photos, like when the camera has a wavelength and then you take a picture of it, you're taking a picture of the light hitting the sensor, right? That's what is taking the picture. And so our ability with a microscope to like zoom in, the limitation on the size has to do with the size of the wavelength of light. So
Okay.
all visual microscopes, all of the microscopes that you just look in that have a light underneath them, stuff, they will all have a limitation based on the length of light, like the wavelength of light. And so you use an X-ray, the wavelength is much smaller. And so you can
Mm.
see much smaller. And you have to use a computer because it's a very complicated algorithm of a pattern that it spits out. It's also like when you see it with the computer, what you're seeing is not necessarily a picture. You're seeing like electron density, but you can
Okay.
see it. You can see it looks like this. It's interesting. Like it will look like it. Like I'll have to send you like a photo of one of the renderings. But it's incredible. It's incredible to like it's incredible that we can see it. I've always just been blown away by that. It like I'm a big nerd when it comes to that kind of stuff. I feel like I didn't talk enough about the CB2 receptor. So one other thing really quickly about the CB1 and CB2 receptors that's actually really applicable to a lot of people is that CBD actually does not have a very high affinity for either of those receptors, which means that it doesn't necessarily interact with those receptors. It's been shown at really high doses to prevent other things from binding to it, and that in general, it can bind to the outside of at least the CB1 receptor. There's some people who believe that it like shares a similar spot with cholesterol, which I think is interesting. But it'll bind to the outside of it and it'll turn it down like a dimmer switch. One of the reasons why CBD can kind of cut the anxiety of THC and why I personally think that it's really valuable to be able to mix them and have them be available is that you can kind of moderate the way that your CB1 receptor is reacting by putting them together.
That is awesome. And that is a perfect segue. Today, we are going to be talking about phytocannabinoids and endocannabinoids. Cannabinoids is something you've probably read on the label of your jar, but there's more to the story. So, Dr. Miyabe Shields, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. These are my favorite molecules, so
Yay! And we've got the hands-on examples, which I always love. So let's just get right to it. Let me ask you the first question.
all right.
Our endocannabinoid system, we know that THC and CBD kind of bind with it, but do we have chemicals within ourselves that actually work with these systems? Why is it there?
Yep. So they are the endocannabinoids. That's why we have the system. So endo just means like within. So they're literally just the cannabinoids within, like within our and why they're there, I mean, they're so important. They regulate, they're signaling molecules. So they are responsible for going all over our body and binding with the receptors and having it control things like, I mean, appetite is one of them, metabolism, like
Wow.
overall brain activity, the immune system, like huge, like, I mean, some of the most important types of things. But they're actually omega-6 fatty acids. So if you've heard of, oops, this is anandamide, and anandamide is like probably the more popular of the two endocannabinoids, as mentioned. It looks like this long, just like ridiculously long
Long chain.
string of fat. Oops. So it's a fat. So it actually comes out of the membranes, and it is an omega-6 that is from right here. There are six, if I can count them, one, two, three, four, five, and six. There are six carbons before you get to this double bond.
Okay.
If I did this, um, if I cut off those ones, Now all of a sudden there's one, two, three. This would be an omega-3 fatty acid. So
Oh,
that's the
wow.
difference between omega-3 and omega-6. And the endocannabinoids are both omega-6 fatty acids. So this is anandamide. Anandamide is more similar to THC in that it is a partial agonist, which means that it turns on the CB1 receptor, but not all the way.
Hmm.
And then there's a second endocannabinoid that doesn't get a lot of love, but I love it because I studied it more than anandamide. And it's called 2AG and it looks like this. So it's almost exactly the same, except for this part right here is attached to a glycerol instead of an ethanolamine. And these two molecules, the way that they bind in the receptor largely has to do with this big, long, fatty tail. They kind of like go in there and just, and it's big and fatty. And when I say fatty, you'll notice that most of these are black. That means they're carbon atoms.
Okay.
And in general, that means that they are lipophilic or fat loving. If you think about butter, butter is mostly carbon, right? Most oils are also mostly carbon. That's part of why cannabis is very sticky. Also, part of why traditionally, unless you're making emulsions or something, you need to use an oil to dissolve your cannabinoids. Same could be said about the endocannabinoids. They are also a fatty system. So yeah, these are the two endocannabinoids. They're super important. All of us have them. We're all making them right now. Interesting fun fact. The reason why the wake and bake feels different is because your endocannabinoid system is different in the morning than it is at night. In general, it's at the lowest, like right before you wake up in the morning. So like, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. It's also why it's really common at that time for people who have either like a migraine disorder, a seizure disorder, chronic pain. That's why that time point can be a really critical time point where you kind of like shoot or jolt awake, or
Mm-hmm.
it's a sensitive time point basically when your
Mm.
endocannabinoid system's at its lowest. And then you wake up and your endocannabinoid system is still low. And then it climbs and climbs and climbs until like kind of like the afternoon, like right afternoon lunchtime, and then it'll begin to go down again.
Hmm. That is very interesting, and that can help some people, maybe with their dosing or their timing regimens, or it just might make sense why they're jolting up awake in the evening. Very
Yeah.
interesting there.
Yeah. I really think that I think in the morning is a good time for me to like be able to prevent symptoms. So like I think I've said it before. It's like, yeah, so the wake and bake is a stoner thing. It totally is. But it's also like a medicinal thing for some people. Like for some of us, that would prevent the whole day from going awry, right? Like,
And me being the non-doctor here, being the stoner, eat your Wheaties. So get your breakfast of champions. No, scratch that. We're being serious here. But the anandamide and the 2AG, which you have mentioned, these are endo, so they're produced naturally by the body. Do they make us high, or do we get them in large enough doses? Do they have a long enough duration? Like, are they just as good as THC?
I mean, I think so. I think it's probably one of the only reasons why I like endurance athletics
Okay.
because long, like, so distance running, like the runner's high, like, I mean, I'm a swimmer, not a runner, but long prolonged cardiovascular exercise will release endocannabinoids. There are other things as well that have been linked to the endocannabinoid system. I know that one of the ones I was the most interested in was I saw a paper that linked acupuncture to the endocannabinoid system. I thought that was fascinating in terms of like a release of endocannabinoids, because acupuncture can make you feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, I know Wim Hof, I was listening to, I think it was a YouTube video of him where he was saying that he believed that the endocannabinoid system was part of his Wim Hof cold exposure,
Okay.
cold exposure breath work. I completely agree. It makes tons of sense. Also, if you haven't done cold exposure, it's an experience. It's also high. So yeah, I mean, I'm chasing all of them. I chase the natural endocannabinoids as well, for sure.
That's awesome. And so THC and CBD, they work on the same receptors as these endocannabinoids. Is there ever a traffic jam, or if one is taken by anandamide, or maybe how long do they sit on these receptors? Is it an all day experience, or?
I don't know that we know that. Yeah,
Okay.
that's called receptor. That's called receptor occupancy, and it's really difficult to study. I don't know that we know the difference because it almost always has to do with a competition between the two things, and it's a competition between THC and anandamide, or THC or N2AG or C, right? And so they're competing, and the thing that drives that competition is how much of either one is there, and they're both kind of always changing. But when I
Right.
mentioned the wake and bake feeling different, that's kind of part of what I was describing is that there's less competition there.
Mhm.
There are less endocannabinoids present at that time period. And to my knowledge, I don't think that our receptors change that quickly, although our receptor levels do change with tolerance. So, like if you're developing a tolerance, you are reducing the number of CB1 receptors. That's why you have to use more cannabis to feel the same way. Um, but I don't know that we know exactly how much time like each of them spends, but we do know that they compete directly for the same spot. At least THC and anandamide do. They compete for the same spot. CBD binds to a different spot on the outside. So the reason why the phytocannabinoids, this is delta 9 THC, the reason why it activates the same receptor is because it is, even though it doesn't look it, it mimics this. Our body thinks that this is this. And actually,
Okay.
part of it is exactly the same. This part of the tail that's the omega 6 is right here. One, two, three, four, five, six. They're exactly the same and they kind of hang out in the same spot. So,
Mhm.
the difference between THC and CBD and why they bind differently is actually just right here. It's just that bond. This is delta 9 THC. It's a three ring structure and it's pretty rigid. But if you break this bond, and I'm going to just quickly swap out the piece, this is now CBD and it
Oh
is a
wow.
two ring structure like this. And it's much more flexible and it has kind of like it's a very similar shape, but it is totally different and feels totally different. So CBD, like I mentioned before, actually doesn't bind to either the CB1 or the CB2 receptor with super high affinity. CBD's main target, it seems to be the serotonin receptor, which is a whole other, interesting side thing. It does turn down the effects of THC by binding to the outside sometimes. But I mean, we're still looking into these things like a ton. And I think that they're fascinating because they do look a lot like the endocannabinoids. They're just in circles, kind of. If you imagined that the endocannabinoids kind of can be in all, look at the shape that it can make. It could almost make a similar circular. Let me see if I can do it. It could almost make something similar, right? It could almost can twist itself
Almost.
into. It can twist itself into something. They call it the hairpin. That's sometimes the way that it's portrayed on
Hmm.
most websites. If you Google endocannabinoids, they'll be portrayed kind of like this,
Okay.
which is the hairpin structure of it. But in reality, it's not like this. It's just free moving all
Oh
around.
wow.
Um, right. And that's kind of similar to how CBD is. So that's the main difference between CBD and THC. But this small, small difference here makes a huge difference in the effects. Right. And that's just like an example of how powerful really small changes can be when you're this zoomed in to the molecules.
In this episode, we are going to talk about cannabinoids and their reactions. Now, this can include ones, as we learned in the last episode, endo, made within us, phyto, those are from outside, coming from our lovely cannabis plant. So, again, I will ask you, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm curious. Well, okay, let's see what the question is. What types there are so many interactions.
Yes. Well, one of the things that we hear about a lot about lately is, the synergistic effect
Okay.
or the entourage or the whole plant effect. Maybe some of these different cannabinoids, like we briefly covered THC and CBD. But what about some of these other things like CBG, THCV? You're the expert here, so I'll let you
Totally.
do the initial soup.
Okay, fun fact. This is the only fun fact, and then I'll get back to then I'll get back to answering the question, I swear. Fun fact about the entourage effect is that the entourage effect was originally coined to describe the endocannabinoid system
Oh wow.
within us, because we have what I showed in the last video. We have 2AG and we have an andamide, but we also have a bunch of other sort of endocannabinoid like molecules that are really really similar. So like basically like they have the same super long tail, like same really really long tail, but then this part is different here. We
Okay.
have one of them that's called N-arachidinoyl dopamine, which basically it's a dopamine molecule on the end right here. We have
Huh.
N-arachidinoyl serotonin, where there's a serotonin molecule on the end here. If people are curious, they're sometimes called Elmiric acids, ELMIRIC acids. And it varies who you talk to, whether or not they think they're part of the endocannabinoid dome. I think they are, personally. And I think that they're fascinating because they're literally an endocannabinoid shoved on with a serotonin or a dopamine. But so there's a bunch of them. And the entourage effect was originally coined to describe the endocannabinoid system and kind of like
Hmm.
the interaction of all of the large, like mostly anandamide and 2AG, but these balances between the two and how it's actually the different levels of both of them will cause very, very different reactions in the body. And so in terms of how it plays into cannabis and like strain specificity and all these different things. I mean, there's more in the cannabis plant than just the cannabinoids, right? There are terps, there are esters, there are so many other things. And then, you know, what I was studying before, real isolates, and then if you smoke, dab, or vape, then you're setting it on fire. And so you're creating a whole bunch of other rare molecules as
Wow.
well. And it does, in my opinion, it does affect the way that they feel. And I mean, I've talked about it at length that I think that even with edibles, there is definitely something there where there are different, they feel different, right? Edibles that are created with distillate or isolate versus like just a butter or
Mhm.
something that is full spectrum. Um, and in terms of like the rares and the rare cannabinoids and what the differences are there, they're very similar to in shape. And so they will compete in some ways, they compete for the same receptors. For the most part, I think they compete with the enzymes also. So I think I
Hmm.
mentioned it in the first time. Enzymes are little machines that are breaking down or chewing up these molecules. And the phytocannabinoids, the ones that come in the plant in cannabis, they also get deactivated by enzymes.
Hmm.
They also get chewed up by enzymes. And they also kind of clog up the endocannabinoid enzymes. Like if you imagine the enzyme is a little Pac-Man and it's chewing up the endocannabinoids, they will get in there and they'll clog it up and then you end up with more endocannabinoids too. I mean, this is something
Okay.
that's been shown with like CBD with a number of different enzymes.
Hmm.
And it's pretty common for drugs to do that. Like if you ever take an Advil or Aleve, then you've taken a drug that has done this because it turns off the enzyme called COX. Um,
Wow.
and so these shapes being really similar will play off of each other like that. And it's infinite though. I mean, it gets really really complicated. So let me go back to THC because um I can pretty easily show you the difference between THC and THCV because it's really only about shortening the end of that chain. And it's funny.
Oh,
Remember how
wow.
I said endocannabinoids are omega-6 fatty acids? Well, one, two, three, four, five, six. THC has that same piece right there. That's delta 9 THC. If we do THCV, we are just popping off two of these, and then now we have three. So this would be omega 4, actually. One, two, three, four.
Hmm.
It's not a fatty acid, and THC doesn't follow that. But it has only three, only three carbons that they need. So that's the only difference, because otherwise it's pretty much exactly the same. And then THCP will just have two more added on to the end. So THC, delta 9 THC, the one that we all know and love the best, will have
Mhm.
five. One, two, three, four, five. THCV, if you pop these off, only has three.
Wow.
And this change is a big enough change to make it have some of the like opposite effects. It's crazy that that really small change will do that, but it'll change the way that it binds the receptor. And if this is present, if THCV is present, it will be competing with, or maybe it's activating some of the receptors in a different way that THC is over here. And then the total domino effect is different because
Wow.
it's not just one receptor and one molecule. Like 1 gram of cannabis has like millions upon millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of molecules. It's like a million times a million times a
Damn.
million number of them. They're so in like
Wow.
1 gram of isolate, right? So there's a lot of these going on. And if you're taking different ones in different combinations, then there's
Yeah.
a chance that they're either directly competing with one another. There's a chance that they are activating different things at different times and that it's contributing to the effects. Another one that you mentioned, so I'm going to put this back on so that it's THC because that's, I'll show you. I'll go first to CBD because it's kind of cool. So CBD is a 2 ring structure instead of 3. You take that out, and all of a sudden it's not a third ring. It becomes 2 rings, and that's CBD is a 2 ring structure like this. It has a double bond here instead, but see, there's no ring. That's CBD. Now, CBG is a 1 ring structure. So this will be the only ring that's left. I'm going to take out this bond right here. All right, this is CBG, cannabigerol. And the reason why it seemed like it was really easy for me to go from CBG or from THC to CBD to CBG, actually the plant goes in the other direction. So people might have heard CBG called the mother of all cannabinoids, and it's actually not. That is not the way that it is. It is in the plant, it's the acid derivative, right? You're a grower, so all the growers will know that there is not no, but there's limited amounts of THC present in the flower. The flower actually has THCA, carboxylic acid, present, and CBDA and CBGA. This is a carboxylic acid. This will go right on here, like that. Boop. This is now CBGA. So the
Mhm.
plant will make this first. That's why CBG is sometimes called the mother of all cannabinoids. But something, it's really flexible. I have noted that about CBD. I think CBG is fascinating. It has activity somewhere right in between CBD and THC. And I do think it feels that way. I do think it feels kind of right in between. It does interact with the CB1 receptor. It does hit a lot of it hits a lot of this different class of receptors called the TRP receptors, transient receptor potentials. They're the vanilla receptor, like one of the ones that interacts with vanilla inside of our taste buds, is part of this like class of receptors.
Wow.
And yeah, it interacts with a lot of those. And I do feel like its effects are right in line with in between CBD and THC, which is interesting because it doesn't look like them at all. But the reason why it was easy for me to do that is because the plant will take this and will take this and turn it into either THC or CBD. So first, that's why if you people who harvest early will get CBGA likely in their flower, right? Because it hasn't yet gone through the process of creating this bond, creating this bond to make it into either CBD or adding the two bonds to make it into THC.
That is fascinating. That is wow. That is great stuff because I'm at a loss for words.
I mean, it's not well understood how they interact together. Something that I talk about a lot is that my favorite mixture is actually 40-40-20 CBG, CBD, THC flour. I mix them
Hmm.
into like a little salad.
Okay.
So I like keep my main grinder. I keep my like biggest grinder just 50-50 CBD and CBG hemp. And then I get to add in whatever THC flour I've got going on because I like to change that one up more. I feel like there's more variability, and that's something that it's kind of been a staple of mine that I've been doing for a while now, where it's super mellow. It's like a daytime. It's like a very, very mellow, no anxiety, like very moderate experience, and it's mixing a lot of these in a way that kind of they buffer each other. And what you're saying about interactions, the entourage effect, we don't. I don't think that we know enough for me to like say like, oh yeah, by doing that mixture, I'm definitely buffering THC, and that is what causes this like reduction of intensity. And it's also, that they potentiate each other because I do feel like THC is necessary. In my opinion, THC makes the effects of the other one. It helps with the other cannabinoids. At least that's been my experience using CBD isolate versus CBD flower, for example, that
Mhm.
has THC in it. And then also using the same amount of CBD flower, but then increasing THC by adding flower back in. It is my opinion, though, that THC will potentiate the activity of some of the rares like CBG, or CBD, which is not the really rare, but and that you can get beneficial effects from mixing them together. I'm a big proponent of that. I definitely think that chemodiversity, or the diversity of the chemicals, the molecules in different products, like they feel different,
Mhm.
and I think people are aware of it. That's why, like, when we're trying, like, it's one of the main differences also between like just a straight distillate that is 80 something percent THC. It'll be reproducible, sure,
Right.
but I don't know, for me, not always the best time. Like,
Well, I think that's actually a huge gold nugget for a lot of people out there, and for a lot of people who are curious and want to experience some of these cannabinoids and the minor cannabinoids. Like you mentioned, a lot of these are found in higher concentrations in hemp, like your CBGs, your CBDs. So I think that is an excellent thing for people to, take away from this episode, is that potential exists. Learn more about these cannabinoids, the reactions and some of the benefits, and how they interact together, because then you can kind of custom tailor something for your particular body, your particular situation. Like you said, it's not a one size fits all thing, but there's directions you can go with it.
totally. And those of us who have a lot of experience end up knowing that, right? Like, we know, we're like, oh, I'm gonna go be social. Like, I
Yeah.
want it to be a little more like this, or like, it's something that comes with a lot of experience, but it's also something that could be intentionally, you could intentionally be trying to shoot for something that is that way. And that's something I think is needs more awareness, because a lot of people are just sort of like, no, I'll roll the dice with what it feels like. And I
Right.
don't think that that's, you can know. I mean, especially, this is not on topic of cannabinoids, but I do feel like terpene profile matters. I feel like the
Mhm.
nose knows. That's what everyone always says. The nose
Yep.
knows.
Yep.
I mean, and
Yep.
it contributes as well. So, and we have early evidence of that, but I mean, this is still an early and exciting time, right? Like, the question is whether or not we had that evidence at the molecular level, would it change the way that we feel about all of the evidence that we have in the community? Anyways, that's just like a philosophical question.
No, it's perfect. And that's something I guess we will leave people to ponder. And this time we are going to be talking about what research is taking place and what results are being hypothesized. As you might have heard in the previous episodes, it's not necessarily new, but on the big scale, it is new and emerging science. Plenty to learn. So I will turn it over to the doctor here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. And this question is just massive, because there has been such a huge increase in research in a great way, in both cannabis and the psychedelics front. There's been just
Mhm.
like a renaissance. And a lot of that has to be attributed to um, Charlotte Figge and her mother, and the 2018 Farm Bill, and decriminalizing, or not decriminalizing, but federally legalizing hemp and allowing hemp to be researched. And then also, a lot of it has to be attributed to the movements that have been going on around medical cannabis for decades and decades, because we have literally only been researching the negatives about it for a very,
Mhm.
very long time. And there's a lot of really exciting research out there. I mean, it depends on what niche you're interested in. I think, like, where you want to go down in terms of like how cannabis can help at the community level with like our chronic pain and people who are suffering from GI issues, let alone like its anti-tumorigenic effects for cancer. Like, there's a bunch of research being done on CBD and anxiety and mental health. And there's also, I mean, and also some of the rare cannabinoids are starting to get more attention and have information on like sleep disorders. My personal interests are like kind of super niche. And I think it's fascinating that the endocannabinoid system interacts with other systems directly. So, we mentioned earlier the CB1 receptor is the main receptor that will interact with THC that causes you to feel high or like altered. And I think it's super interesting, but the CB1 receptor can actually bind to other receptors like the serotonin receptor, like the dopamine receptor, It's called heterodimerization, and it's like a transformer effect. They come together and they're like, by the powers combined, and they
Yes.
signal together. And I think that that is something that's super fascinating. It's been shown that like those of us who, are regulars will have different levels of these dimers in
Hmm.
our brains. Like we have different levels of serotonin, specifically 2A, which I also find interesting because the serotonin 2A receptor is the one that's responsible for psychedelic experiences for the
Wow.
most part. It's the one that's like more linked to that. And I find that part fascinating. I think that like exploring into what I was calling the endocannabinoid dome, there's a lot of more new research on like kind of like lower level interactions, or not lower level, but almost like the entourage effect within our bodies of all of these other smaller endocannabinoids and how they interact with them. And like an example I could give is that like my enzyme that I worked on, which was a little machine that chewed up the endocannabinoids and deactivated them. Um, it worked on the endocannabinoid 2AG. That was like its main, that's why it's called an endocannabinoid enzyme. But it was very promiscuous. I mean, it was chewing up a lot of other fats and stuff. And I just think that that is understanding sort of like that promiscuity at both the enzyme level, how they're acting, and then the receptor levels, and then also at the level of the phytocannabinoids. Like an example for that is CBD. Like CBD has been posited to have like 65 targets in the body plus. I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't more. This is very, very flexible. And we're still finding like new interactions or combinations of these cannabinoids and how they can have different effects when they're used together and when they're used for specific people. I'm also really interested in all the research coming out with cannabis or the endocannabinoid system and autism spectrum. And there's a good amount of evidence linking clinical endocannabinoid deficiency to it. And actually, I didn't define this in the previous ones, but I think I mentioned that maybe not, but that endocannabinoid system is linked to chronic pain, mental health, and GI issues. I call it the triad of suffering, and it sucks. And I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's really common for someone to have more than one of those things. And it's pretty common if you have more than one to have the third as
Right.
well, because they kind of all play off one another and they all flare within one another. And there's a theory by Dr. Ethan Russo called clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, which also it is a theory. Clinical endocannabinoid deficiency is a theory, but a lot of science things are still theories, even though we have a
Right.
lot of proof for them. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that some people have lower levels of endocannabinoids. And so these phytocannabinoids are a balancing effect, right? Because I believe I have clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. It would be hard to tell now since I use cannabis so regularly and it alters those levels as well. But if you have lowered levels of endocannabinoids, it's associated with chronic pain, GI issues, and like neurologic issues like migraines are associated with it, as well as PTSD, fibromyalgia, and
Right.
IBS, or irritable
Yep.
bowel syndrome. And I'm pretty interested in a lot of the emerging information on that, on specifically clinical endocannabinoid deficiency and how cannabis can be helpful for people with clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. There's been, this isn't super recent, but there's been a good amount of research on PTSD and night terrors,
Hmm.
and that THC specifically will impair your night terrors. I mean, yes,
Right.
it when people ask me if I'm concerned about my REM sleep because THC interferes with your REM sleep, I tell them no, because I have night terrors. So if I have
Right.
REM sleep, then I'm having night terrors
Yeah.
and I am waking up and, vivid and sometimes violent. Like, are they dreams? Like, yeah, they feel like reality. And that experience, um, it goes away when using THC for a lot of people who have PTSD. And this isn't like super new research, but I think it's really interesting because I think it's linked to, the CB1 receptor levels and being able to change that with your cannabis intake. And so there's so much just really, really cool research out there. Like sometimes I just go on just like if I have an hour and look at
Mhm.
it and just see it because it's a lot. I mean, it is like every day something new. And the mainstream media will never cover it. They're never, not never. I mean, I hope they do someday. it's really hard. If you see the amount of positive research that's out there, I mean, it's pretty large and substantial. And yet all the big headlines that make it out there are the
Mhm.
negative research headlines. And a piece of that is propaganda, a piece of that is federal legalization and like control of the media. That's a
Yeah.
whole other topic. But like, it's like, the amount of research that's coming out with the promise of what cannabinoids, what rare cannabinoids, like how they can help with humanity. I mean, it's
Yeah.
huge. So I'm excited about it.
As am I, and I am so glad that you broke it down in that way too, because it paints a pretty good picture of where we still have to go, what we can discover, and what we think we already know we will discover. Because yeah, like we were talking earlier, science likes to wait until it's really obvious that there's a benefit to
It's
something.
it's never certain though. Like that's the point of science is that like the whole point of science is that we never know what we're going to discover next and that it's quite possible that everything that we think is wrong.
Mhm.
Everyone thought the earth was flat until it's not, and then some people still do. I mean, we won't talk about that. But like that's kind of the whole point of science is that it's always evolving. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like being really, really sure, that medical system, that's a perspective that's been put into our minds, very specifically devaluing other types of medicine,
Mhm.
that are maybe happen to be not of colonial like background. And it's a type of scientific elitism that does it quite frankly exists in a very, very real way, and it has real effects on our health and wellness. So it's there. The good research is out there, but it's definitely not to be like, oh, it's not proven and it's all
Right.
early. People like to say that, and I think it's like, yeah, kind of, but it's also like kind of proven in the community too. So there's.
Yeah, that there's decades of anecdotal evidence that is now finally being allowed to be investigated in a proper manner. So we will see some things coming up. But is there one particular or maybe a couple resources for people to search, or are there a couple good keywords people can type into Google to find, these reportings, or where to go to find a compiled list of some of these?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most valuable things to learn how to do is to go on to PubMed. So it's all one word, PubMed. I think it's .gov. Because this is kind of like one of the larger repositories. Another one would be Google Scholar, which is
Mhm.
scholar.google.com. They're one of the bigger repositories. I like PubMed because you can search, and same with Google Scholar, but you can search by like free and other things, keywords. But
Right.
I would go down rabbit holes with that. And I would encourage people to start trying to read just the abstract. And if you're having a hard time with the abstract, so if you're not familiar, the abstract of a scientific paper is like a little summary and it will always be free. So if you go to pubmed.gov and you just type in cannabis, it'll just it'll pull down like it'll give you all of them that kind of like fit under cannabis. Let's say you find one that you want to read, you click on it, it'll give you the abstract right there. The abstract is just one paragraph and they almost always follow the same exact format. The first couple sentences are telling you what the problem is that they're investigating, then the middle chunk is telling you what they did and what they found, and then the very end is telling you what their conclusions were from the study. And one of the most valuable skills I think people can have is learning to read scientific literature, if it is just reading the abstract. Because we've done some content together where we're talking about scientific articles. I mean, it gets dense. It gets inaccessible. It gets really difficult to read. But for the most part, a lot of scientific abstracts are accessible. The
Mhm.
first couple of sentences and the last couple of sentences are the most important things to be able to read and understand. And yes, like in the perfect world, you would understand the whole thing and be able to read the whole paper. But that's not reality. That's incredibly inaccessible for
Yeah.
for most people. And I think that that's a really great place to start to be able to look through. And like I've been curating some free resources on my website. I hope to be doing like paper reviews on them too, where I kind of break them down and make them easier. But
Sure.
we'll have to do another video series.
Out. Anything else you want to say about the future?
I think it looks good.
Awesome. I know. What a
At least I
poorly
hope
framed
so.
question. Look into your crystal ball. No, all right. Well, hope everybody's had fun. Again, this is not the last one, so keep coming back for this special series, and we appreciate you watching. So until next time, peace out, everybody.
1, 2,